2 episodes ago, we walked through how an attacker moved through Kestrel Health's network for 6 weeks, stage by stage, using the ATT&CK framework. The stage that mattered most wasn't the initial breach, a phished contractor credential, nothing exotic. It was what happened after. The billing service trusted a request from the appointment scheduling service without checking anything beyond which subnet it came from. This episode is about the model Kestrel rebuilt around afterward, and the strange fact that NIST had published that model years before Kestrel's breach ever happened. Last episode covered exactly why that castle and moat model doesn't hold anymore. Cloud, remote work, and device sprawl each eroding what inside the network even means, stacked on top of an older structural flaw the model always had. Treating, got past the firewall, and trusted with everything behind it as the same event. Kestrel's breach is the concrete version of that flaw. One phished contractor credential, and everything past that single gate was theirs to explore for 6 weeks. This episode picks up exactly where that one left off. If the perimeter can't be the whole strategy, what actually replaces trust because you're inside as an architecture? Not a slogan, an actual model with actual enforcement mechanisms. In 2020, NIST published Special Publication 800-207, Zero Trust Architecture. And it's still the reference model most real implementations trace back to, whatever vendor's logo sits on top of it. The model rests on a small number of tenets, worth holding as a checklist, not a philosophy. All data sources and computing services are treated as resources. Nobody gets a default trusted tier. All communication is secured regardless of network location. Access is granted per session, evaluated dynamically based on identity, device posture, and behavior, not granted once and assumed forever after. And every access decision runs through an explicit policy enforcement point sitting between requester and resource, with the authority to say no. NIST also names the logical architecture behind that last tenet, and it's worth knowing the 3 components because you'll see them relabeled in every vendor's zero trust product. A policy engine makes the actual trust decision. A policy administrator takes that verdict and configures the communication path, issuing or revoking the session. And a policy enforcement point physically sits in the traffic path, enabling, monitoring, and eventually terminating the connection. NIST also describes what actually feeds the policy engine's decision, and it's worth naming because it clarifies what dynamic really means here. The engine draws on continuous diagnostics data about the device making the request, threat intelligence feeds, activity logs from across the environment, a data access policy defining what the resource is allowed to expose in the first place, and identity management systems confirming who's actually asking. None of this gets checked once at login and ignored for the rest of the session. A VPN checks your credential once and trusts you for hours. A zero-trust policy engine can revoke that trust mid-session, the moment device posture or behavior looks wrong, without waiting for you to log in again, which is precisely the continuous verification that would have caught Kestrel's attacker on hop 2 instead of letting them wander for 6 weeks. NIST describes a few different ways to actually deploy this, and choosing between them isn't arbitrary. Getting it wrong means re-architecting later. A device agent and gateway approach puts a lightweight agent on every endpoint that must check in with a gateway before reaching a resource, which breaks down fast. Anywhere you can't guarantee an agent gets installed. Contractor laptops, unmanaged BYOD devices, IoT hardware that can't run one at all. An enclave-based approach groups related resources behind a single gateway, useful when resources genuinely cluster by function, like a set of microservices belonging to one product, but awkward when a single request needs to cross multiple enclaves, because now you're coordinating several gateways instead of one. And a resource portal approach routes everything through a single portal the requester authenticates against first, which works particularly well for third-party and contractor access. Exactly the path Kestrel's attacker exploited, and exactly the path Kestrel prioritized rebuilding first. Kestrel, in fact, ended up running two of these models simultaneously rather than picking one architecture-wide resource portal for third-party and contractor access, enclave-based for the internal microservices cluster. That's more common in real deployments than the tidy single model diagrams in most zero-trust marketing materials suggest. One clarification worth making here, because the industry has muddied it. Zero-trust network access, ZTNA, is a specific product category. Vendors selling a VPN replacement that authenticates a user before granting access to a specific application rather than the whole network. It's real and useful, and it maps reasonably well to the resource portal model we just covered, but it is not the same thing as zero-trust architecture in the NIST sense, which governs every request between every resource, not just the initial remote access hop a human makes into the network. A lot of the "we're already zero-trust" claims that don't survive contact with a real incident come from conflating the two. An organization buys a ZTNA product, replaces its VPN, and stops there, solving exactly one of Kestrel's problems and leaving the internal service-to-service gap that actually mattered completely untouched. Back to Kestrel. Their redesign didn't start with buying a product. It started with an architecture decision. Every service-to-service call, no exceptions, now passes through a policy enforcement point that checks identity and context before allowing the call, not just at the network edge, but between internal services that used to trust each other by default, simply because they sat on the same subnet. They phased it. The first phase targeted exactly the access path the attacker had used, third-party contractor access, moving it behind a resource portal with its own enforcement point, session-scoped and time-limited, rather than a standing VPN credential good until someone remembered to revoke it. The second phase introduced an identity broker between internal services, so the billing service stopped trusting came from this subnet, and started requiring a verifiable service identity on every call. Only in the third phase did they extend policy enforcement across the rest of the internal estate. The rollout wasn't without friction. One legacy billing subsystem, built a decade earlier without per-request authentication in mind, couldn't support the identity broker without a rewrite. Nobody had budget for that quarter. Rather than block the whole program on it, the team placed that system behind its own tightly scoped enclave gateway instead. A known, documented, monitored exception rather than a pretend absence of one. A real zero-trust rollout will have exceptions. The difference between a mature program and a fragile one isn't the absence of exceptions. It's whether they're deliberate and watched instead of forgotten. There's a practical objection worth addressing directly, because it comes up in almost every design review where this gets proposed. Doesn't checking identity and policy on every single request add unacceptable latency? Implemented naively, yes. A policy engine that makes a synchronous network call to a central service for every request will become a bottleneck at scale. Real implementations solve this by pushing the decision as close to the enforcement point as possible and catching aggressively. A sidecar proxy sitting next to each service can evaluate policy locally in microseconds using a policy bundle periodically synced from the central engine rather than phoning home on every call. We'll get into exactly how that works mechanically 2 episodes from now. The short version here is that zero trust and acceptable latency aren't actually in tension once the enforcement point lives at the right layer. They're only in tension if the policy engine is built as a single central choke point every request has to round trip to. It's worth being honest that nobody does this in one sprint, and Kestrel didn't either. CISA's Zero Trust Maturity Model breaks the work into 5 pillars: identity, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and data, with 4 maturity stages within each. Traditional, where trust is still mostly static and perimeter-based, through initial and advanced, up to optimal, where trust is fully dynamic and continuously validated. The model also names 3 capabilities cutting across all 5 pillars: visibility and analytics, seeing identity, device, network, application, and data signals in one place rather than 5 disconnected dashboards, automation and orchestration, policy changes happening through orchestrated workflows rather than someone manually reconfiguring a firewall rule at 2 in the morning, and governance, an actual process translating security requirements into enforced policy, rather than a document in a wiki nobody's opened since it was written. Skipping straight to pillar-by-pillar maturity while ignoring these 3 is a common failure mode. You can be advanced on identity and still have no way to see how an identity layer policy change affects data layer risk, because the connecting visibility layer was never built. The useful insight isn't the stage names, it's that maturity is tracked separately per pillar, and real organizations are never at the same stage across all 5 at once. Kestrel was optimal on almost nothing the week of the breach. A year in, identity had moved furthest because that's where they started. Networks and data were still catching up. That unevenness isn't a failure of the program. It's what the model predicts, and it's a far more honest way to report progress to a board than a single, "Are we zero trust yet? Yes or no?" One more practical question. How do you know a zero trust program is actually working, beyond a maturity self-assessment that can drift toward wishful thinking? The most honest test connects straight back to the framework from 2 episodes ago. Take the lateral movement and discovery techniques we walked through and run them deliberately in a controlled way against your own environment. A purple team exercise rather than waiting for a real attacker to test it involuntarily. If a simulated attacker with a single compromised credential still can't reach a sensitive resource without tripping an enforcement point somewhere along the way, the architecture is doing its job. If they can walk from one compromised service to another the way Kestrel's attacker did, the self-assessment was optimistic. That single test, can one compromised credential reach something it shouldn't, is a better zero-trust health check than almost any dashboard. It's worth being upfront that none of this is free, and pretending otherwise is how architecture teams lose credibility with the people funding the work. An identity broker, a policy engine, service mesh tooling, and the engineering time to migrate services onto all of it is real budget and real months, not a configuration toggle. The honest business case isn't zero trust prevents all future breaches. No architecture does that. It's narrower and more defensible. It reduces the blast radius and dwell time of the breach that will eventually happen anyway, turning a potential 6-week network-wide incident into a contained, quickly detected one. Kestrel's board didn't approve this program because someone promised perfect security. They approved it because someone showed them, concretely, which specific gap had already been exploited and what it would cost to leave that same gap open a second time. We'll come back to making this exact case to a board with real numbers behind it later in the season. Three mistakes show up constantly when teams adopt this on paper but not in practice. First, treating zero trust as a product you buy rather than a set of architectural decisions you make. A vendor's zero trust branded VPN replacement doesn't help if your internal services still implicitly trust each other once traffic is past it. Second, applying the model at the network edge only and stopping there, exactly the gap that let Kestrel's attacker move laterally for 6 weeks undetected. Third, and this one sinks more programs than the other two combined, trying to apply optimal stage enforcement everywhere at once instead of prioritizing by actual risk. Kestrel didn't try to instrument every internal call in month 1. They started with the access path that had already been exploited, then expanded outward. A team that tries to boil the ocean usually ends up with a partially configured policy engine, a frustrated platform team, and nothing fully protected, arguably worse than the honest, phased unevenness the maturity model describes, because at least that unevenness is deliberate and tracked. Zero trust gives you the model, verify explicitly on every request with no exceptions for network location. But a model that says verify everything doesn't by itself tell you where your specific design is likely to fail before an attacker finds out for you. That's a different discipline, threat modeling, and it's exactly how you'd have found Kestrel's billing to scheduling gap on a whiteboard months before anyone found it the hard way. That's next episode. If you're architecting systems that need to survive being breached, not just avoid it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.